Welcome then everybody to the third seminar of the 2021 series on Sephardic thought and modernity, co-sponsored by the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, King's College London, the International Network for Jewish Thought of Complutense University of Madrid, Center Sefarat Israel of Madrid, and the American Sephardic Federation, and organized and coordinated by Dr. Yuval Ivri and myself, Angie Cohen. So throughout this series, we have been looking at the uses and modalities of concepts like Sephardi, modernity, and modernization, their different specificities, and the diverse cultural fields from which they emerge. We have tried to analyze some of the numerous processes of change that have impacted the different cases of Jewish modernization that we are studying. In the first meeting, Maghreb presented a project of Jewish modernity connected to a Sephardic heritage of modernization, understood as a process that goes back to the 10th century with Saadia Gaon through contemporary Arab culture. He presented this process as conceptualized by Avraham Shalom Yehuda, who reclaims the historical connection of Judaism and Islamic thought as a model for a new Hebrew and Jewish culture in Eretz Israel, Palestine. Almog Behar spoke about the problem of equating modernization with secularization and nationhood, which render people monolingual and monocultural. In our last meeting, Yaakov Yadgar continued the conversation about Sephardic modernization by discussing the case of traditionism or Masortiut, as different Sephardi or Mizrahi interpretations of contemporary Jewish identity, which present an alternative to the European-based conceptualization of modernity as obligated secularization and disconnection from religious or traditional pasts. Traditionism or Masortiut, claims Yadgar, constructs a narrative of continuity and change inherent to traditional transmission. Thus, the attitude towards the past as based on continuity would be one of the defining elements that distinguishes traditionism from secularization. Today, Clemens Buluk will discuss the work of Rabbi Elia Benamozegh and his conception of Jewish universalism, his reclaiming of the term Oriental, and the importance of publishing as a cultural and political intervention in favor of the Jewish communities of the Maghreb and the Middle East. She will discuss some of the aspects of Sephardic Enlightenment and will continue to expand our understanding of Jewish modernities. Clemens Buluk is the Carl Bernice Whitten Assistant Professor in Jewish and Israel Studies at Columbia University in New York. Her academic work deals with Jewish thought and mysticism, interreligious encounters, intellectual history, and networks with a focus on the modern Mediterranean and Sephardic worlds, as well as the intersection between religion and the arts and the study of the unconscious. On top of her academic activities, Buluk has also published numerous novels and essays in French. Welcome, Professor Clemens Buluk, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Angie and Yuval, thanks for this generous introduction, and thanks for organizing this very important event. Thanks to all of your partners as well. It takes villages, even virtual ones. So I'm extremely grateful to be given this opportunity to talk about Elia Benamozegh, modernity and modernities, maybe plural. So I'd like to started by talking about the paradox of this rabbi for scholars. Like Benamozegh is a well-known but still a little obscure figure, so I'll try to give you a few biographical pointers and see how his work is significant today. So the 19th century Livornese rabbi of Moroccan descent, Elia Benamozegh, is best known for his magnum opus, Israel and Humanity, that was published posthumously in French in 1914, in which he contended that the Jewish tradition had the capacity to solve the political and social quandaries of his time. He claimed that its mystical tradition, in particular Kabbalah, enabled Judaism to take part in a larger transnational conversation about the role of religion in contemporary times, and basically to salvage religion. Another key claim of his was that the universalism of Judaism was predicated upon its particularism. So that's a paradigm that he deemed especially useful for thinking a multifaceted modernity. Thanks to his Christian disciple, Aimé Pallière, who actually edited this volume. Benamozegh died in 1900, and Pallière was left with this 1900 pages long manuscript that he reduced to 700 pages in a very complicated tale of mentor and disciple across religious traditions. Benamozegh's ideas became influential in France in the first part of the 20th century, to a lesser degree in Europe, and exerted some influence on some representatives of the Second Vatican Council, and certainly on proponents of interreligious dialogue. But these aspects are the better known parts of the rival legacy. What deserves further consideration, this is what I'm especially happy to be presenting here today, is that Benamozegh had a distinct notion of the role of the Jewish difference, and especially of an Oriental difference, in order to reconcile religion and science, religion and modernity in general. And he used various media to convey his message to multiple audiences. So in addition to being a prolific writer who published in Italian, French, and Hebrew, he was an active publisher who was operating out of the historically active hub of Livorno, his hometown. And he really sought to weigh in through his catalog of Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic books that he distributed across the Maghreb and the Middle East, and promoting a mixture of Enlightenment and tradition that aimed to create a distinct Oriental modernity, independent and often critical of the Western experience. So I will first look at Benamozegh's genealogies that explain why he had this broad vision of what he called the Orient had to offer, the impact of these genealogies on his thought, and the way in which he acknowledged them, and sometimes actually really praised his descent. Then I'll turn to the impact of what he defined as the Orient on a pivotal aspect of his thought, which is the centrality of Kabbalah and the importance of thinking beyond the binaries that he saw as a problematic product of a narrow understood Western Enlightenment. And finally, I'll probe his role as a printer and a publisher, and I'll zero in on one specific example where he discusses the European presence in the Orient and the colonial presence. And he's pretty critical, about it. And this example is Benamozegh's preface to a book by Eliyahu Hazan, which is called Zechron Yerushalayim, that was published in 1874. The very object of his, that very object, Eliyahu Hazan's book, is noteworthy in so much as it is almost an unidentified flying object. I mean, Benamozegh wrote in French an introduction to a book penned in Hebrew by an Orthodox rabbi, making a bold case for the relevance of Judaism in fighting the conservatism of certain European legislations, notably on divorce, and somehow flipping European and colonial assumptions on their heads, meaning that modernity was actually not where they claimed it was. But let me first turn to Benamozegh's lineage. So Benamozegh is both a very singular thinker, but also a very typical poor Jew who was born and never left Livorno. It sounds like maybe would have ventured to Florence, which is maybe 40 miles away, to attend a conference. But Livorno is extremely important in his mental and religious landscape. It was a free city. It was made a free city in the 16th century in order to attract Jewish merchants in an instance of mercantile cosmopolitanism, and there was never a ghetto in Livorno. So it became an intellectual and religious nexus where the Maghreb, the Mashriq, and Europe converged, just as it did in Benamozegh's own life. So he was born in 1823 to a family of Moroccan descent and of rather distinguished rabbinical ancestry. So the very name Benamozegh, sort of gives it away, says it. The name is the son of the Berber, which suggests an ancient presence in Morocco since the Amzigh were the Berber groups living in the Maghreb before the Arab conquest, who'd converted to Judaism in late antiquity. Benamozegh only penned a very brief autobiography of 10 pages, in which he did trace his paternal ancestry back to Morocco, Fez, and highlighted a famous ancestor who was granted the name the title Prince of the Nation for having supported the King of Fez in the 17th century, and who appears in the final pages of Jacques Banache's famed Histoire des Juifs, History of the Jews, that was first published in the mid-18th century. And so that's cited by Benamozegh as really a token of their worthiness in the Moroccan kingdom. So Benamozegh's father, Avram, was born in Morocco. He moved to Livorno, and he was living childless when he asked for approval of his first wife to marry a younger woman, who became Elia's mother. That's a particular retelling that Benamozegh seems to be, proud to share with the reader. And he adds that his father entrusted a missionary to the Holy Land to pray for him that he should have a male progeny. And so apart for his this brief autobiography with this detail, Benamozegh's accounts of his family history are pretty rare and mostly found in prefaces or texts that he published in Hebrew, and they all emphasize Morocco as his family nexus. It also makes it clear that Benamozegh's father was a student of his maternal grandfather, Rav Koria, and the Koria family various positions of power. And the maternal ancestor, Avram Koria, was a renowned Dayan, so judge, who was active in Tétouan and appears in one of the best-selling travelogues of the 18th century, Samuel Romanelli's, called Travail in an Arab Land. So we do see that the lineage of Benamozegh matters and created this legacy of rabbis and judges. Elia's maternal grandfather, Avram Koryat, moved to Essaouira, from Fez to Essaouira, and around 1788, and the Livornese Jews who were in Mogador at the time offered him the position of Dayan in Livorno, where he went on to direct one of the many yeshivot, Beit Yosef Franco for the Livornese among us, of which Benamozegh would later be a student. So we do see how tight the networks between Livorno and Morocco were. So Benamozegh's father passed away when his son was 5, and then he was raised by his widowed mother and his maternal uncle, who's a very influential figure in his life. He was a prominent rabbi and Kabbalist, Yehuda Koryat, who traveled incessantly between Mogador, so Essaouira today, Gibraltar, and Livorno, which was a very well-trodden path for rabbinical exchanges in the Western Mediterranean. And so we also see that the Italian port city, alongside those commercial networks, had religious and scholarly networks that were created. And Benamozegh's family really instantiates these networks. So by his, his very being and his very lineage, we do see this anchor in this Western Mediterranean. And so Avram, Yehuda Koria, sorry, the uncle, was really pivotal in Benamozegh's upbringing, and Benamozegh never failed to actually pay tribute to his father figure. And in his correspondence with his frenemy, you would say, Samuel David Luzzatto, who was the other towering figure of Italian Judaism in the 19th century, but was very unfavorably disposed towards Kabbalah, Benamozegh talked about his upbringing, and he even mentioned something about his handwriting, and says in the letter, my calligraphy is African because I learned the Hebraic rudiments from the good soul of my maternal uncle, one of the honorable Corians. So the story of Benamozegh's handwriting goes beyond the anecdotal. African here means Maghrebi, and he shows that it's a facet of his Moroccan erudition that really sort of reverberated into his own understanding of the Jewish tradition and the canon, and crucially in the significance of the Zohar. So the Book of Splendor, which is, as you know, the foundational text, one of the foundational texts of Jewish mysticism, which is a commentary on both the Pentateuch and a pseudo-epigraph written in the 13th century by Moses de Leon, but that was attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a sage of the Talmud that lived in the 2nd century. And that was around the time of Benamozegh really dismissed as being a forgery, something that Benamozegh never really wanted to acknowledge, and said that, even if it had been the case, the significance and the teachings of the Zohar prevail. And so in this autobiographical sketch, Benamozegh describes learning from his uncle and from the Zohar as this kind of intimate experience. And I said, I just mentioned that it's a book of splendor, the book of light. And the passage that I'm going to read is really this kind of, dialogue between light and darkness. So here is Benamozegh. During the long winter nights, he read the Zohar with me by the feeble light of a tallow candle, at least twice, it seems, from the beginning to end, instilling in me through words and above all through actions, the flame of the fear of God, together with the observance of the precepts and the practice of mystical piety. So that description of the teachings of the Zohar is extremely important, because what Benamozegh does here is that he frames his study of the Zohar as an observance of the commandments. And that puts him at odds with most of his contemporaries, who saw Kabbalah as this kind of antinomian device, something that would be backward, that that was actually in the wake of Shabtai heresy, something that would actually destroy the law rather than reinforce it. And so that's something that Benamozegh always opposed. And one of the binaries that made him aware that binaries were not necessarily the most useful concepts to approach any topic, but especially religion. And it also shows how his education was much more of a Moroccan one than an Italian one. Indeed, in Italian Judaism, ecstatic Kabbalah played a significant role, but the Zohar only played a marginal role. And Benamozegh's first publication, it's always interesting to see how people enter or become, a writer. So his first publication in 1839 at age 16 was a short preface to Ma'or Shemesh, the Luminary and the Sun, which is a collection of Kabbalistic texts edited by his uncle. So as we see, Benamozegh's stances on Kabbalah stem from his almost transplanted Moroccan upbringing and training. And the reason why the Zohar was also largely untainted is that the Moroccan kingdom was largely extant from the influence of the first attempts to alienate the Zohar from the Talmud that actually prevailed in Christian Kabbalah, where there was this disjunction. Obviously, Christian Kabbalists would not reclaim the Talmud. And that explained the way in which the Zohar fell into disrepute in Europe, but that was not the case in Morocco. And the Kabbalistic commentaries, their interpretation of the Mishnah, for instance, or of the mitzvot, were very popular in Morocco, in particular in the 16th century exegesis of Al-Ashkar and really was an insistence of the ethical teachings of the Zohar. And that's something that Benamozegh really embraced fully, to the extent that when his Christian disciple asked him for, for a reading list, as he was, getting interested maybe in converting, which he eventually did not do. But that's where Benamozegh sent him this, the intersection between Kabbalah and Musar, the ethical teachings of the Zohar. So, Judaism, as a result, which he actually called Hebraism in Israel and Humanity, the masterpiece that I told you about in my introduction, was important, and he called it Hebraism in order to emphasize its ethical message and not just its law. So he was aware of the fact that maybe Judaism had this, came with a baggage of assumptions from on the part of the non-Jews, and he really wanted to show how it was more than just a legalistic, set of law, interpretations, and that it could provide both old and new foundations for a new understanding of the meaning of religion. So that would also be a response to those who accuse Judaism of only being, law-centric, and thus not really a religion as Kant would have it. And in his Hebraism, Kabbalah, as he understood it from a very young age, had a specific role to play. So Kabbalah means, reception or tradition. And what Benamozegh offered was also a radical revision of tradition, which he posited not just as something which, is constructed, as Hobsbawm and others would have it, but as a sort of polyphony, something that you actually find in the Talmud that enshrines the possibility and even the necessity of dissent. So, think Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? The idea that dissent is actually something that is going to be beneficial for those who have yet to come. So it is almost a token of faith, of what the future, how future generations will be able to look at those interpretations. And so for him, Kabbalah and tradition in general was forward-looking. And that, he postulated, always, in a kind of distant feud with Kant, was not very far from Kant's practical reason. And so basically the philosopher of the Enlightenment that denied Judaism the possibility of calling it a religion was, unbeknownst to him, actually using Jewish concepts that predated his thought. And I must say that reclaiming an aspect usually held to be Christian or not Jewish and asserting its Jewish origin was one of Benamozegh's favorite pastimes. So you see this many times in his writings. So Kabbalah was also, as he presented it in Israel and Humanity, the secret mystical tradition that had been passed down to initiates, and that actually transcended religious beliefs. So his defense was based on the idea that as a blueprint of the world that was waiting to be progressively revealed as human capacities would allow, so making space for progress, tradition and Kabbalah was suited to embrace changing times. And there was no need, as a result, to distinguish between science and faith or progress and tradition. And so Kabbalah was thus key because of its, expensive way of, again, like making space for the future based on the past. Even though those, time in Kabbalah is a little more complicated proposition, but that's, one of the aspects that made it important to take into consideration, but also because of a set of hermeneutical tools that could be turned into a political discourse. And this is another of the innovations of Benamozegh, saying, and that's something that, for instance, Rav Kook will later take on, the idea that Kabbalah actually can become part of a political conversation, not making it, like there's still a stock of concepts that are only for the initiates, but this is also something that is going to show that humanity is on its way to progressive revelation and maybe messianic times. But one of the central tenets in his, again, that toolbox was the coincidence of opposites, which was contained in the notion of berur, B-E-R-U-R. I mean, well, I'm not going to spell it in Hebrew, which is both separation and assimilation. And so basically, Benamozegh says, wrote in Israel and Humanity, one knows the important theosophical doctrine of berur, which is choice, separation, according to which Israel would be responsible everywhere and at all times to sort out the false from the true, the sacred from the profane, what is pure from what is impure. And in fact, I mean, the selection process, you know, showing again that Kabbalah and science are not at odds, is almost reminiscent of Darwinian theories, of which Benamozegh was quite aware. So you have the first stage of a process, which is this kind of selection, followed by a second stage, which is assimilation. And so the organisms actually assimilate others and become stronger. So as a result, in Benamozegh's view, coexistence cannot and should not be feared. And this is one of the instances in which he feels that binary oppositions are misleading. Berur shows that things that seem to be completely at odds can be reconciled in what he called a religious crucible. So again, pagan and non-pagans, they're sort of sparks of truth, of divine truth that need to be elicited, teased out, and then that coincidence of opposites can take place. So that's a place in which, you know, the boundaries between Jews and non-Jews are, you know, questioned or not necessarily effaced, but transcended. And that's also a place where religion, theology and science can meet. And this is, that kind of progressive assimilation in time is also connected to progressive revelation of those greater religious and scientific truths that humanity will come to accept. And that actually science is, I mean, science is a way to show that the blueprint of God is being revealed progressively. And so the imitation of the divine also enables this, because through the perfection and the progress of human mind, then there is this kind of pathway towards greater understanding of what the plan is. Yeah, and finally, in addition, Kabbalah was a myth-making force for Benamozegh that was able to show the shared origin of humanity through notably the figure of Adam. And that was a way to foster a new kind of religious imagination that would show that there is this kind of shared stock of references. So in many ways, Kabbalah quite strikingly resembled the collective unconscious. And that's not a coincidence that Benamozegh was writing at a time of the emergence of the concept of the unconscious that was expressed by the German thinker Eduard von Hartmann, whose work took Europe by storm and was duly dissed by Nietzsche, but that's something that was part of the conversation. And Benamozegh said that basically this collective unconscious that was, you know, discovered by Europe had always taken place within Kabbalah, and that's only this kind of new consciousness of what Kabbalistic images and myth was that made a difference, but it was always present. And especially in the Orient, where Kabbalah had this a place and was playing this role, as opposed to Western Europe, in which, you know, in the wake of the Escala, Kabbalah was dismissed as, again, this kind of backward mental activity, basically. So the rabbi was really adamant that what was denigrated as the Oriental, superstition had something to teach Europe and the West, and especially in its understanding of how to overcome binaries such as religion and science, or, you know, again, faith or reason, that had led to the sort of alienation and certainly the estrangement of most people from or wannabe believers from the mainstream or institutional religions. And his rejection of the dichotomy extended to rejection of the distinction between contemplation and action. Again, Benamozegh strengthened his stance against Renan's claim about the inertia of Judaism and of the Semites in general. And he said that it was only because of a misleading conception of mysticism that Judaism had been called both mystical and passive. And that was maybe in order to pave the way for a colonial civilizing mission by which an allegedly scientific modern mind would prevail and usher Orientals into modernity. That's something that Benamozegh could not accept, because in his view, mysticism aimed to improve man, not to make him retreat from society, and thus was an integral part of this, new, this shaping of a different kind of enlightenment. And so that's what he says in the History of the Essenes. This is how we see the Orthodox Orient, the prophets and the doctors who, when they push contemplative life to its ultimate implications, do not stray from the path that leads to the improvement of man as a whole. Heaven and earth, if these were not synonymous for them, they were certainly tightly connected. Morally speaking, Hebraism located earth in heaven a long time ago, before Copernicus was born. So again, like, he's really completely crushing the binaries that, again, between science and religion, since basically he's saying that Hebraism had anticipated Copernicus's discoveries. But Benamozegh did not turn this understanding of the Orient into an object of investigation as domination, right? He's not Saïdian avant l'heure, he's not a Saïdian other. He envisioned Judaism as part of the Orient that must be redefined to European readers, and whose contribution would prove key to, I quote him again, the improvement of man as a whole and partake in the future of religion. That was crucial to salvage them and show a sort of unity, a united front against secularism. And so basically what he shows is that the contribution of the Orient rests on a greater harmony between the external and internal, man and society, heaven and earth, contemplation and action, and that's what it could offer. And so, to be sure, sometimes he used the Orient loosely and essentialized it in order to answer his critics, but he really saw this concept as a potential for regeneration, and really in contrast to the inertia that's typically associated with the Determinist era. So the Orient functions not just as a geography, but also as a mental space, a concept in which new continuities can be established instead of those dichotomies that only encourage, some sort of alienation, since he really claimed that there is an essential appetite for the transcendent in the human spirit. And so Benamozegh saw those dichotomies as really born out of the Western European civilization that threatened to exhaust itself, and that would be dangerous for even the creation of a good society. So that was the message that was geared toward a non-Jewish audience, mostly in French, in Israel and Humanity, and in Italian, in the story of the History of the Essenes. That's something that Benamozegh was, trying to convey, again, with the help of his disciple. But I also want to give you a brief overview of Benamozegh's endeavors as a publisher, which are not really well known. So he, and that also map Oriental networks and a different kind of modernity. So he started out as a publisher almost as soon as he became a rabbi in the 1850s. And the sacrosanct bibliography of the Hebrew book, yields 163 books printed by Benamozegh and his associates over the course of almost 50 years, between the establishment of his printing press in 52 and his death in 1900. And so there is a widely accepted estimate of the number of books that was published in Livorno that would be approximately 1,500 volumes. So according to this estimate, and bearing in mind that the inventory might not be fully comprehensive, Benamozegh's publishing house produced about 1/10 of all the Hebrew books published in Livorno between 1649, which is the establishment of the Gabai press, and 1939. So that's a significant chunk of the printing activity. And Benamozegh's turn to publishing as an intervention, not just as a kind of bread and butter or vanity publishing that could help for his lifestyle. So that turn to publishing was arguably a response to a particular disgrace. And that's a very interesting and surprising episode in his life. So in 1862, from 1862 to 1865, one of the first books that he published, again, he was born in 23, so he's still pretty young. Benamozegh published a 5-volume Hebrew biblical commentary called Em la Mikra, so the Mother of Scriptures, or the Matrix of Scriptures. And the book is a very, peculiar work. It has its subtitle is in Italian, and it characterizes the project as follows: a Pentateuch with comments, research, and extensive scientific, critical, and philological notes. So rather than a running commentary on the Bible, Benamozegh skipped entire passages when he saw fit. And the book is somehow a pretext for sketches of the ancient Near East, or what he calls Lunghe note di scienza, which is extensive scholarly notes. And what he wanted to do was to place Jewish texts, the scriptures, in their historical context. And he was very attuned to the new directions of the science of religion. He was, he subscribed to every possible journal, but his own orthodox agenda also, and the tone, the kind of bombastic tone, made it unfit for scholarship. So he was but it was also unacceptable for his more orthodox coreligionists. So a good example of this impossible stretch that he was trying to achieve was when he opened the Hebrew commentary on Leviticus with a quote by Spinoza, and he continued with multiple uses of multiple comparisons between Mediterranean myth and the Jewish tradition. And so in 1865, the rabbis of the rather conservative community of Aleppo condemned Em la Mikra as cherem. And so that's forbidden, that's banned. And they justified this very rare act of censorship. Spinoza was famously targeted by cherem on 2 main counts. Benamozegh claimed that the use of external non-Jewish texts could advance the knowledge of Torah, and the bold comparisons that he made between Torah and pagan mythologies. And so he ordered his books banned and publicly burned. Then the Aleppo rabbinates, the Damascus rabbinates followed suit. The Jerusalem rabbinate was a little more hesitant. But Benamozegh's proclamation of orthodoxy had been well known to Aleppo rabbis. He had interns from Aleppo who worked in his printing press. And he was even the publisher of a few volumes of sermons by the members of the community. But the rabbis still decided to make an example of him, to warn against the westernization of Judaism and to sort of really reiterate the boundaries between Jews and non-Jews that Benamozegh's commentaries seemed to challenge. But again, keeping in mind this, the importance of berur, of this, assimilation, the idea that there is a coincidence of opposites, that was not a category that Benamozegh really recognized. And so that created this gap that led him to move away from writing in Hebrew. So from that moment on, again, that really very painful episode for him, and except for self-defense that he published in 1871, really defending himself against his critics, he turned mostly to French. And what he did is that he delegated his interventions to the thinkers that he published. So you can see his catalog as an intervention, having others speak on his behalf, or, I mean, to be sure, it has this kind of, prayer books and other, obscure publishing. But the more substantial part of his catalog, which is about 50 books, calls for, showcases authors who seems to advocate his understanding of an Oriental modernity, and sometimes defend Benamozegh himself. So that's really interesting to see how Benamozegh created this web of relationships, and you can actually, map this those intellectual affinities and the scope of these affinities by looking at the eskamot, so the rabbinic approbations that you find in the books, and that really demonstrates both local and transnational affinities or shared values. And so the authors that he published most of the time challenged both the binaries constructed by the Western Enlightenment, such as secular versus religious knowledge, but also the rejection of reason as part of the more conservative communities. So basically, they emphasized also the importance of tradition in the making of an alternative non-European path to modernity. And so in general, there is a few points of difference, but his authors' view did align on at least one of Benamozegh's core stances. And so that effort to strike a balance between tradition and new customs, new mores, appeared clearly in the book that I mentioned in my introduction, so Eliyahu Hazan's Zichron Yerushalayim, which came out of Benamozegh's press in 1874. So that's a good case study for what Benamozegh seemed to try to convey in his work as a publisher. As I mentioned, the introduction is in French, interspersed with a lengthy Hebrew quotation of Eliyahu Hazan's relative, Israel Hazan, written to Benamozegh, and it somehow captures Benamozegh's efforts to speak to multiple audiences on their own terms and sometimes in their own language. So you can say that it's, a glorious failure, because trying to address too many audiences at the same time might not have yielded the results that he was hoping for. But he did try to speak to multiple audiences. So the introduction, as I mentioned, is in French, and it details the argument of Hazan's book and gives a sort of outline that was most likely geared towards the more assimilated readers who could, presumably only read in French. I mean, for some people whose family comes from the Maghreb, like the idea of all French-speaking so-called elite was very much something that Benamozegh was aware of. And so Zichron Yerushalayim consists of, then the book itself consists of a dialogue between two characters. You have a Palestinian rabbi who's called Ager, the stranger of the guests, and an assimilated North African Jew, Ezra, the citizen. So that's also using the category, very Third Republic categories. And those two characters reflect on the effects of modernity and of emancipation that Hazan had witnessed himself as a Meshula, so as an emissary to Algeria and Morocco. And so, it's almost autobiographical on the part of Hazan, but the book highlights the worth of the tradition of the diaspora against the temptation of reform, but also the necessity of teaching foreign languages, philosophy, and the humanities in addition to religion, if only to establish the significance of Judaism. That's exactly what Benamozegh was doing, just, showing that Judaism sometimes, or most of the time, had anticipated those discoveries and those scientific breakthroughs. Hazan's stances, however, were more conservative in other ways. You find an absolute rejection of the Copernican system, which Benamozegh seemed to be very keen to embrace, as I mentioned, as we saw in the previous quote of his. And also Darwinism is not something that Hazan seemed to be very excited about. So that put him a little bit at odds with Benamozegh's embrace of contemporary science as part of a broader understanding of progressive revelation. But they nonetheless really shared this common grounds on the importance of engaging with their non-Jewish environment and with secular subject from a Jewish tradition point of view. And not create those, the fault line between Judaism and the sort of alliance or colonial environments. So it is probably for the more assimilated readers, again, that Benamozegh mounted an apology of enlightened Orthodox Judaism in French. His goal is for people to realize that, quote, true orthodoxy is not the blind enemy of any innovation that people think it is. And so using Hazan's work as a springboard for his own apology, Benamozegh defined what he called enlightened religion as follows. It is a religion, quote, which takes into account the state of science, which tries to persuade and not merely have supporters. So, I mean, this sounds like a pretty standard defense of a reason-based religion. But then he claimed a sort of counter-intuitive provenance of this enlightenment. And he says, it is all the more likable as it comes to us from the place which everything came to us, from which everything came to us, from Palestine, from Jerusalem, our holy and dear mother. So ex-oriented looks, basically, from the Orient comes the light, he continues. And so Benamozegh then observes that Hazan's engagement with philosophy is akin to a tradition with Jewish polemics and apologetics that is guided by the necessity of proving the relevance of Judaism when confronted with other religious systems. So you do see that he's both, I mean, he's doing multiple things at the same time, showing that there is this provenance of disputations, but that's also something that needs to be, persuasively supported and argued for. That's not something, it's not about having supporters again, like it's really having a more expansive understanding of how religion can make a case for its own tradition. So Benamozegh framed the debate not as a competition between two belief systems, but as a necessary accommodation between religion and reason. He claimed European Israelites themselves, raised amid science and modern civilization, demand from their rabbis the ability to justify their religion before the tribunal of human reason, lest they witness incredulity wreaking further havoc every day. And there, the term tribunal of human reason is revealing as it appears in Kant's critique of pure religion, sometimes as court of reason. So given Benamozegh's ample quotation of Kant in his writings in Italian and French, this cannot be incidental. And in the critique of pure religion, the questions debated before the tribunal of reason do not necessarily come to a resolution. However, they must be confronted, and if need be, in a polemical fashion. So basically, Benamozegh is really reclaiming this idea of disputation and not just, and also reclaiming it from the poster child of Western Enlightenment. So demonstrating Judaism's affinity with the modern world, and especially in its Orthodox version, and if need be polemically, is what Benamozegh set out to do by emphasizing the backwardness of the civil status of women in Western legal systems. When he examined the possible clashes between religion and civil law in his introduction, thus Jewish versus French law in territories under French rule, he highlighted the dangers of such oppositions. A religious marriage would be considered null and void whenever it is not preceded by a civil celebration of marriage, he said. But what is equally concerning for him is the following hypothesis. What would happen if a man had to repudiate his wife, and regardless, civil law would declare the marriage indissoluble? So in this construct, Western law would be responsible for potential polygamy. The point, though, is not to proclaim, is not to proclaim the primacy of Jewish law, but really showing how those clashes impact people's life in the most intimate way. And so Benamozegh does turn all expectations on their head. Polygamy was widely associated with Oriental backwardness and aberration, but however, the rabbi claims that, quote, the real fault lies with the law that bans divorce, an absurd, conflicted, immoral, antisocial piece of legislation that freedom civilization will, one should hope, end up abolishing forever from all legal codes, the legal codes of Europe. So thus the confrontation between Jewish law and European law, by exposing the shortcomings of Western European law, can effect positive changes in the Western legal system. And that's also a jab at the role of the Catholic Church in a country in whose language he was writing, France, a country that was paradoxically proclaiming reason-based values and universalism, but was still under the thumb of the church. And indeed, divorce was established in 1794 and repealed in 1816 after the Restoration due to the influence of the Catholic Church for the most part. And it would be reestablished by law in 1884, but Benamozegh was writing in this interval, and he really mentions and condemns this idea. And Judaism, in his view, resorting to the Jewish legal system is meant to promote social progress. Jewish law is not an absolute, but something that can be a corrective. And so that is another one of the ways in which Benamozegh would really turn expectation on their head. And so, to be sure, he was a correspondent of the Livornese chapter of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and he was very familiar with the language used by the educational project of the Alliance that was bent on spreading modernity to Oriental Jews, with Oriental being really having this negative connotation. So the question is, what was the term Orient? Was he trying to mimic their language? And so that, using the concept of mimicry as theorized by Homi Bhabha in order to analyze the strategies used to gain civil acceptance. But here in Homi Bhabha, there's a key difference. So for Homi Bhabha, mimicry results in camouflage, right? The idea is that you sort of erase differences, whereas Benamozegh's goal was really to affirm Jewish worthiness. So I guess that a more illuminating concept would be Paul Ricoeur's appropriation, taking a concept that's from an alien, different culture and assimilating it, which is again something which was so pivotal in Benamozegh's thoughts, that the idea of assimilation, in a gesture which is actually akin to possession, a reposition. So Benamozegh reappropriated the language routinely used in the language of civilizing mission and turned it on its head. And so for him, the Jewish exception is also an ironic reappropriation of a certain French universalism turned into Jewish universalism, and the case for an Oriental Jewish modernity. And I'm almost done, but in his preface, Benamozegh highlighted the contents, but also the texts that the reader is about to read. He says, the style is philosophical, elegant, simple, didascalic tone of our great writers, and a bit too of the Israelite German that will recognize in our Palestinian rabbi a worthy follower, imitator of its best writers. So he's invoking didascally, which is the instruction of training of the chorus in Greek ancient drama, something that would probably not have made the Aleppo rabbis very happy. But he also emphasized the theatrality of philosophical dialogues as a genre. So he's really replacing Judaism in a broader cultural context. He's also mentioning our great writers, people who were, involved in former disputations. And altogether, there's this kind of the necessity of staging other opinions that functions, again, like as a tribunal, but one that is less concerned with sentencing than making space for multiple voices and dissent. So by writing in French for an audience of Hebrew speakers across the Mediterranean, Benamozegh tried to expand his audience and sway it in defense of his conception of a renewed, less conflictual modernity grounded in Judaism. The Jewish difference is thus presented as a true version of enlightened universalism, something that is multilingual and polyphonic, but also a hybrid. It's a universalism that's based on particularism, one that the Orient, as he viewed it, could exemplify. So Benamozegh, in expanding those categories and in dislodging binaries, thus really helps us expand our understanding of modernity and really ushering in the plural of multiple modernities. And what he also does is offer the possibility of envisioning modernity through its margins, through, again, like he's really not writing from the point of view of a Berlin Jew, but really looking at the ways in which the margins are actually able to weigh in and displace modernity altogether. So that's another reason, I think, to read Benamozegh and to reconsider the dynamics of modernity. Just as, you know, people have done it, Olga Litvak or Elie Stern have done it recently in Eastern Europe in their reevaluation of Ascala eastward, but I think that really the time has come to look southward. And if modernity can be understood as the capacity to reimagine social or religious relationships, Benamozegh certainly offered a different narrative of modernity, and one that I believe is very much needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Clemence, for a very, very interesting lecture. I see that there was some confusion about the time when this started, because there are some people who are joining now. Anyways, I would like to let people know that the questions will also be recorded. So if you don't want to appear on camera, you can write your questions on the chat and we'll read them for you. I think there were, so yeah, please feel free to open your mics and ask questions.
I'm looking at the chat just before, and I'm seeing that Rabbi Sanford Chenot talked about, you know, the late beloved teacher Josepha, and he's certainly someone, I mean, whose writings on Benamozegh and work on Benamozegh is, you know, in parallel, and he, yeah, so that he's someone that that helped us sort of really introduce, ushering or give Benamozeghs a larger audience. So thanks for
yes, thank you for such a wonderful introduction to Benamozegh, and Chacham Faur, Alav HaShalom, he really did make Benamozegh part of our lives, and it was alive. And when I would be at Hebrew University at the National Library, you know, or I would be at Bar Ilan or any other, or JTS, I would scan in those days, probably photocopy one book after another of Benamozegh, and it really has, and then I had them bound beautifully, and I spent a lot of time in France with the US Navy and our ships, and I was able to pick up all sorts of books, you know, like this book. I have also this one.
Yeah, exactly.
Really gorgeous things, you know, and there is just no end to it. And the position of Luzzatto, and how we had to look, and I collected his books as well, but it was a real fight, you know, it was alive. And since I was with, pardon me for getting it all out, but it's really part of me. I spent a lot of time in Italy, especially since I was living in Napoli with the Sixth Fleet of the United States Navy, and coming up to Livorno a lot, you know,
There's
and
still
going to the synagogue, and there's just so much. And everywhere I go, the Haggadah and all of his books that he had printed, just beautiful things. So thank you so much for sharing this. I hope that the whole world gets to hear you and see you and learn more and more about this.
Well, yeah, hear him. I mean, I'm just a conduit. But yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. The book that you showed, the Israel and Humanity, is part of a, so that's the abridged version of the abridged version, right? So it is, and that's one of the reasons why Benamozegh's legacy is a little controversial, as I mentioned in the introduction, because so Pallier was this disciple that Benamozegh discouraged from converting, saying, well, you will be, your work will be worthier if you make a case for the Noahide laws. So I didn't get to talk about the Noahide laws because it was not necessarily part of that Oriental modernity that Benamozegh was a champion of. But Pallier was certainly this disciple who worked on this abridged version, so 1900 page manuscript to 700 page manuscript, but that was then decried as having Christianized Benamozegh's message. And then that version came out after World War II, and that's an even more shorter version. And that's the version that if you're reading Benamozegh in English, you'll read because the Pauline Press based its English edition of Israel and Humanity on that abridged version. So basically, Benamozegh's work is even more, expensive and more vibrant than what we have, because we only have those condensed versions. But it's already very rich. But it is even richer in the manuscript.
Yeah, and it's amazing that the original English translation came out at the time of the American Civil War and coming out of San Francisco. Just incredible. And I have that up on the shelf, bound, copied and bound. And that whole thing is so much part of my life about the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the Noahide commandments, and that whole attitude towards Christianity or the rest of humanity is just such an amazing attitude to have had and to share with the world, and I hope we all adopt it. And the other thing that he mentioned in that particular book had to do with the fact that Christianity, thinking it was the new Israel and the new world, had dropped all of the Torah laws. But then the Catholic Church had to create their own laws, and those are the laws that are not perfect as Torah law was, because it was human law that they had to come up with something, because they're living in this world. That is so important, I think,
I mean, that's what I mentioned in my presentation, that Benamozegh also, one of his favorite hobbies or activities was to really show the lineages, the roots of Christian concept that had been completely claimed by Christianity and that actually had Jewish roots. He does have, in one of the books that he showed, Jewish and Christian ethics. He really sort of emphasizes this. I mean, it's not hijacking, but the necessity to acknowledge the provenance of certain concepts in order to be able to rebuild a world in which you do show where, I mean, like there is almost a moral imperative of creating this unity instead of claiming certain ethical teachings for yourself or for your faith.
Yeah, I think that there is other. I saw Professor Tzvi Zohar, I think, that wanted to ask.
He was trying to ask a question, but he left.
Sad.
Yeah. I think that there has been some confusion with the starting time. So there are people that are arriving now. And
so if there is other people that want to ask questions, please,
yes, please feel free to jump in and ask your question, or write it on the chat.
There's a few questions that I can one of the questions was whether he taught Kabbalah to his congregants, and the answer is he not only did he teach Kabbalah to his congregants, but also he was an important teacher. And he keeps talking about how Livorno is this place, I talked about the margin and the virtue of speaking from the margins, but he also said that it was basically people had no interest, and he called it a place of lethargia, the biosha of the mind, but he was very dedicated to his students. And his students actually took on this those teachings with their ethical worth. And I mean, I don't think that it's a coincidence that Livorno was one of the more liberal cities in the country. That the Communist Party. I was in Livorno before the world became. In January 2020, so really before the world shut down. And that was, I mean, you still have the Communist Party, and people say that his social and ethical teachings really shaped the mentality of a number of young Jewish thinkers, and including one whose name will be recognizable to a number of you, which is Modigliani, not the painter, but the brother of the painter, who was a leading figure of the socialist of socialist Italy. And you can also, and this is not a chidush, but Benamozegh was on the committee that had Modigliani do his bar mitzvah. So he was on the examination committee, and that is really documented. And so he did it in 1897, Modigliani. And so there is a case to be made for this kind of universalism of shapes, and in the painting of Modigliani, that is also where he claimed that what he was looking for was the unconscious of, we call the unconscious of the race. I mean, obviously race didn't have this kind of baggage that it came to have, but really trying to elicit or to tease out what those common features of humanity that Benamozegh was also trying to showcase in his work theologically. So you can also see Benamozegh's influence reverberate in unlikely places like this socialist youth of Livorno, or the painting of Modigliani. So.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. If there's no other questions, I have. Thank you very much. It was really fascinating, and I really enjoy reading your articles, and I'm really looking forward for the book. And I think that the interesting thing it's part of looking at our series, and we were talking in the first meeting with Almog Behar about the figure of Abraham Shalom Yehuda, and I can think about other figures maybe in more contemporary with the Benamozegh, of kind of Sephardi intellectuals that are local but very transnational, and they are working with, of course, press is very important, and they are very multilingual. I'm thinking about Bechor Chutzin of Baghdad, or Shlomo Tvina in Calcutta, people that are working on press that are in between what we today we won't be able to classification, put them in boxes of religious or secular or between languages. Most of them wrote in Judeo-Arabic, in Hebrew, in European languages, and so I was wondering if in your work you did this you tried to trace this kind of figures in the 19th century. If you could see them before or after, is it a particular moment in the middle of the 19th century these kind of figures emerged?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, and also the way in which they completely blur the boundaries between secular and religious. I mean, this idea of And again, like if that's why I insisted on this concept of, berur, this assimilation, something that actually is porous, but it's also a place of contact. One of the definitions of Kabbalah by Benamozegh is a place like it's connecting shapes. So obviously, where there's connection, there's friction also. So that means that disputations are absolutely fine and they should be pursued. But he really was part of this effort. And so if you're thinking of the notion of the printing press as something that establishes or that's part of European nationalism, right? Benedict Anderson, the way imagined communities. Well, you do, if you look at Benamozegh as this transnational thinker, and those thinkers that that you're working on, they sort of debunk this notion. I mean, those imagined communities don't have to be national, and so this is the different kind of universalism that they're offering and that they're proposing. And again, in a way, it doesn't. I don't want to make it sound like it's completely opposites, because Benamozegh was a very proud Italian Jew whose work during the Risorgimento made him be on the suspicious activity lists of the Austrian regime, and he was suspended from all his teaching activities because he was seen as too much as a patriot. He gave impassioned speeches where he compared Moses and Dante, which is, again, like one of this kind of very bombastic Benamozegh style of speeches. But what he said is also, the more Italian, the more universal, the more Jewish, the more universal. And this is this articulation between particularism and universalism that he was also keen to illustrate in his work and in his writings. And that's something that is really worth noting, because you would expect this concept from Levinas, right? There is this idea that the Jewish particularism is actually a kind of universalism that's not the Enlightenment universalism that sort of levels that erases differences. And Benamozegh really foreshadowed this understanding. And so I try to, trace some sort of Benamozegh's influence on Levinas, because obviously Levinas was more of a Talmudist than a Kabbalist. And there's actually points of contact in, and that's something that I trace in the book, in post-World War II France, where Benamozegh's influence was very still present through Pallier, through his disciple, and through this generation of the French Jewish Renaissance in the 1920s and 30s. And so there is a place in which that could explain this unacknowledged influence. And obviously it's a big claim, but I asked Levinas's daughter-in-law, and she said that yes, I mean that's something that he was aware of it. I mean, then there is no, I mean, influences are harder to prove, and like there is no footnoting, but there was certainly an awareness of Benamozegh's work. And this is again this idea of universalism through particularism that was extremely important, and that again goes against a more this universalism of Paulinian kind of universalism, like, right, that creates this the man, but that erases all neither Jew nor Greek that it describes, but actually makes it almost without particularities, and that creates almost an abstraction of man that Benamozegh thought was very dangerous, because it's untenable as psychologically from a human perspective. So
there is a question of Professor Yakov Yadgar. Says, thank you for this fascinating talk. Can you say something about the reception of his work within the Jewish world?
Right. So that's a fascinating question. So there is a number of moments in Benamozegh's reception. The first moment is in his lifetime, during his lifetime. So for Italian Jews, and that's something that you see a little bit in this controversy about the ban. Who was his audience? He was trying to reach an audience that was not necessarily Jewish, but that was not necessarily religious, but he was also very, he had a very assertive tone. So that could have rubbed Christians the wrong way. At the very same time, Christian reformists welcomed his work because they thought that that would be really a way to move past this kind of conservatism of the church that was, the pinnacle of which was the syllabus of error of the Pope, saying that there was a wholesale rejection of modernity. So the the initial moments were maybe more attentiveness from Christian reformists, but then again through Pallière, and ironically Pallière became an advocate of Zionism. He was considered for the position of rabbi, preacher in the Reform community, but he never wanted to convert, and he also felt that that would be disloyal to Benamozegh. So he had this kind of marginal position, but he really exerted a huge influence on Jewish the Jewish thought, youth that tried to make a case and like to really acknowledge the potential for ethical values, for universal. I mean, again, this kind of Jewish universalism that Benamozegh was trying to promote. So you do see that the interwar period was very keen on expanding this self-definition of Judaism, so that Jewish Renaissance. Then as I mentioned, in the right after World War II, in the leading up to the Second Vatican Council, there is this idea of really creating the conditions for interreligious dialogue that and with also some sort of emphasis on Kabbalah that created that sort of mindset and the possibility of dialogue, and now what is really interesting is that Benamozegh has this very convoluted legacy. That in Israel now there is a number of right-wing Zionists who are reclaiming Benamozegh thoughts. In the settlerist movement, because of the Noahide laws, that the Noahide laws, and that his thought enables them to think about the nations, a little bit like Rav Kook, but it's like that would be another kind of intellectual figure that would help them think about the non-Jews and nations, and especially from the point of view of the Noahide laws, and really apply it to political circumstances. So basically looking at using the Noahide laws to create this hierarchy and make a theological case for second-rate citizenship for non-Jews in Israel. And that is also one of those interesting alliances with some evangelical movements, and there has been conversations around the questions of the Noahide laws between those two groups. I mean, we know that there is this convergence, right? And that has been, ideologically and politically increasing these days. But this is where this is where Benamozegh's reception lies today too. So this is also something that I was fascinated with and also perplexed by, which is how come that this advocate of interfaith or rapprochement or encounters would be used by people whose agenda and whose worldviews were so completely different. And then, this is another, it would be another talk altogether, but the way in which he uses Kabbalah and the porosity basically of the materials make for this the plasticity of the reception, right? I mean, when he's talking about Adam, Adam could be this universal figure, and this is what he claims, but for people who have a different kind of agenda, Adam is also only Israel, right? So if you establish the primacy of Adam and claim that it's this universal, like this unity of mankind, but someone else tells you that they know the origin and that the true origin of the concept is actually Israel's primacy, they can come up with a completely different interpretation, and politically the stakes are pretty high. So this is one of the ways in which Benamozegh's legacy is so was controversial, because then, you know, add to this the fact that one of his key interpreters were a Christian man who never converted because Benamozegh asked him not to, but you know, you can pretty much claim that there is no such thing as Jewish universalism, and that it's a Christian invention. And that creates, you know, then what we're talking about, this the use of Benamozegh as this kind of bridge between religion, all of a sudden the bridge crumbles a little bit.
As I had mentioned in the chat notes, that Professor Faur had said that when we study Benamozegh, that it's necessary to be able to separate out the Kabbalah from his other teachings, especially, as I had mentioned, with the Emla Mikra. And he did that with all sorts of other scholarship, with Velikovsky and his writings, which Professor Faur was very interested in, and I was reading. But he said that you can find something very important, but set aside other things that are not what you need, you know. So that's important, yes.
Right, but who makes you the? I mean, there is also the very question, which is, you know, key as to does it mean that there is unbridgeable or like unsurmountable boundaries, and what does that? What does it say about being able to study the tradition of someone else, a different tradition, right? Do you have to be part of that, I mean, to be born into this tradition in order to study it? And the language that's used to describe Palier's interpretation is, you know, very often dismissive. I mean, saying that he doesn't have the proper training and that he sort of missed out on the references, the mythical references, but it's also a language of unfaithfulness, which, you know, creates, you know, like this kind of marriage between the Jews and their tradition, and so he would be an interloper, and there's a really interesting language of, you know, being faithful or not, or being able to be faithful or not. So that really raises questions about, like, what are the boundaries of, you know, that you cannot transgress when you're studying someone else's, I mean, when you're studying another religion, or when you're trying to be almost the speaker on behalf of Benamozegh. And Benamozegh chose that, I mean, Benamozegh's sons and his family also chose him in order to be the spokesperson. So that's, you know, that's one of those ambiguities. Yeah.
Well, I think we should probably get to the end of the meeting. We've been here for an hour and a half already, and so we want. Oh, I am sorry, I missed it. Isaac Nauser Fati has a question, and he's been waiting. Do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, but so basically it's a question about the article on Spinoza and Kabbalah. So Benamozegh wrote about Spinoza as a Kabbalist who actually didn't exactly understand, and that that this misunderstanding also explains. I mean, it's not from someone who got into a harem to another. I haven't really. So the article was published in French, and I haven't found any reaction at the time. I think that was part and parcel of Benamozegh's demonstration of the dangers that a misunderstanding of Kabbalah could represent. He also turned Jesus into a failed Kabbalist. Someone who misunderstood them. Basically, the Trinity being a misunderstanding of the upper Sefirot, and so, but so the fact that those people misunderstood and spread widely that conception of Kabbalah doesn't disprove the worth of Kabbalah altogether. And I think that was. But that's not something that I mean, at least I haven't found any significant figure who took up this Spinoza article and took Benamozegh to task about it. He was, for instance, also, he came up with a chidush about Paul, a sense of Paul as basically someone who was describing his ascent to the third heaven as evidence that Paul actually was fighting Kabbalah. And so that's something that, for instance, Bousset and early 20th century scholars explored, and actually, that revolutionized, or at least that changed the perception of some of Paul's understanding of Kabbalah and his, how steep in Judaism he was. But no, I wish I had found anything, because I think it's also a fascinating, very Benamozeghian way of reassessing, as you said, it's this assimilation of, or the coincidence of opposites. So looking at the aspect of truth and trying to sort of reframe it in a different way. So really, there is nothing which is outside the boundaries of what can be seen as material for reflection and in Judaism. And so that's why he also explored those sort of heretical figures. But no, I'm sorry about that. If anyone ever, I scarred a few, but no. But thanks for the question. I mean, this is really so interesting.
Thank you, Clemence, for your invaluable contribution to this exploration of different Jewish experiences of modernization, and thank you for adding another layer to the complexity of facing universalism that takes itself as the default rightly moral position from which to look at modernity and humanity. You've brought so many arguments that weave into this conversation that we've been trying to have here about different modernities that don't necessarily assume either this universalism that erases everybody else's story, nor the dichotomies that sustain this kind of universalism very often. So thank you very, very, very much for this rich lecture, and for your willingness to answer all these questions and to be here with us today. So really, really thank you. And thank you all.
I'm looking forward to the next sessions. I mean, I know that Knafo is coming up, who was published by Benamozegh, so I can't wait for Gabriel Amansour's talk. So
yes, and speaking of which, we will see you all again next month on is the third Thursday of every month. So Yuval, do you have the date there?
Yes,
Not to put you in the, I also don't know. Like, I'm also not sure. So just to remind everybody, it's the 20th. Okay, yeah. So the 20th of May, we will see you all. Please remember that we have changed the time a little bit so that it will be more comfortable for those in Israel, in the UK, in Spain. So it will be at 12 p.m. Eastern time. We will send an email and we will repeat it, but just for you to know, okay? So thank you all for being here, and we will see you next month. And thank you, Clemens.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. Welcome.